Welcome everybody to Two Guys in a Stack of Comics. I'm Reed. Along with me, as always, is Mike.
Hey guys.
Today, what we're going to do, we wanted to talk about something that's very near and dear to Mike and I's hearts. It's kind of comic books in themselves. We talk a lot about comic book movies and things, but I think for guys like me and Mike, the comic books are always the heart of it. And really wanted to look at why we think modern comic books and kind of newer characters are not connecting the same way a lot of the old school comic characters are. And that if you really look at the last, I want to say 30, 40 years of comics, really outside of a couple characters, your Deadpools, your Cables, maybe Miles Morales, you haven't had a lot of characters that are new connect with audiences the way that a lot of the old school characters did. So Mike and I just want to talk a little bit about why we think that's happening and why we think some of those older characters have connected with audiences better than these newer ones.
Yeah, I've just, I add books to my comic book library all the time. And this is one that I had when I was a kid. It was the first history of comic books. And it came out in 1965, and they had a copy on eBay for like 20 bucks, and I got it. I remember getting a copy of this in the 70s when I was a kid and just being fascinated with, you know, the the great introduction that Jules Pfeiffer wrote, but then also like this was the place where you could, they reprinted all the origin stories
Yeah.
of the original heroes. They had Batman #1, Superman #1. They had the Spectre,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which is, maybe an undiscovered guy that they could put into the cinematic universes. They had, of course, my favorite, the Flash, right? The Golden Age Flash. And it was just really cool. I mean, before the days of omnibus and digital stuff, where you could go and pull up this was the only source book that you had for this amazing material. They even had the Spirit there, Will Eisner's Spirit.
Classic. Okay. Yeah.
Just really cool. And of course, on the cover, this was of huge interest to me, the Superman and Batman. And I must have reread those origin stories like, 100 times. It was just really cool to see the old Schuster artwork and, Superman's origin and his first issue told, and Batman, because you were never going to see that, in 1970s America. You're never gonna see this stuff.
Yeah. No, it's really cool that they used to have stuff like that that kind of gathered those all together. And I think, for me, when I look at some of those older ones like you highlighted there, I think what always stands out to me with older comic book characters like Batman and Superman and even Marvel's folks like Spider-Man and the Hulk, I feel like the origin stories that we were given back in the day for superheroes and kind of what set them apart always made the characters behave very differently. In that, when I was a kid, when I read books, a Batman comic felt distinctly different than any other comic I would read. Spider-Man felt distinctly different. Superman felt different. And what I feel like with a lot of the new characters that get created, I feel like those distinctions don't exist anymore. I feel like every new character kind of falls into the same sort of, self-depreciating humor, um, kind of know-it-all science genius. And it used to be something really interesting where you'd have, characters like Batman were very staunch detectives and scientists and had their skills. And then Superman had a lot of skills, but he didn't have that science angle or things like that. It kind of just feels like now, like all of the characters that we're getting of the modern age of comics all kind of seem like they adapt the same exact personality. I don't know. That's been for me what's kind of warned me off of new characters. For you, Mike, as you've seen newer characters introduced, what's kind of not connecting as much with you with newer characters as opposed to some of the classics?
Um, I think the industry took a turn for the dark, in the 90s, and it was like a race to the darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the new characters that came out, like maybe like the Punisher and I'm trying to think of who else.
Like Deadpool and Cable and characters like that.
Deadpool, Cable, yeah. Um, just a different, kind of feel. And they were playing to an older audience, and and to degree it worked. But you can't really underestimate the impact that the older characters had on the population. I mean, we had, when you look at the publishing numbers, some of these comics from the 40s, they would sell 1 million a month.
Yeah.
And Captain Marvel, I think, was up to like 1.3, 1.5 million some months.
Mm-hmm.
They're moving a lot of comics. I don't think all the comic companies combined sell 1 million copies a month
Not a
now.
month. Yeah, no.
No, and so it's just different. I think it probably has to do with we've lost a lot of the audience, and they're not playing towards the kids anymore. They're just playing towards the adults. And
I think
so
that's a great point for sure.
and when you talk about some of the newer characters that come out, and even the revamped modern characters that they do, there just seems to be a little bit of whimsy and innocence that's missing. And I think it was done on purpose to entrench and to captivate the older audiences, people like me that grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and keep them interested in reading comics. So and I appreciate some of those stories when you talk about Frank Miller's Daredevil and what he did with Batman. I mean, that was really interesting. And now we're in a new era where we have, these cross media characters that go from comics to movies to video games to animation. And so you really have to have, you really probably have to build a different kind of character, or at least they're thinking that way. But maybe they don't. What do you think about that?
No, I think the great point you make. I think comic books weirdly decided to no longer cater to kids.
Yeah,
What I think you saw with the MC, and I think the greatest example of what happens when you kind of kick kids out of the equation is the difference of the MCU and the DC universe in the movies. The MCU, I always remember going to see those films, seeing fathers and mothers with their sons and daughters, laughing, smiling, having a good time. The adults were entertained, but the kids were, really happy with it. In the DCEU, you'd go in and the kids would kind of be like, why is this so dark? And you could see the parents were kind of covering their eyes at some point, and you'd have stuff with like movies ending with Superman dying, and you've got little kids in Superman costumes like crying because the Superman Batman movie ends with Superman getting skewered. And it's one of those things
so crazy. Why?
you can directly
Why?
see. No, you can really directly see like DC decided we're going for the adults. Marvel went for the kids. Marvel kind of bridged that gap and threaded the needle perfectly as far as creating movies that were mature enough that adults liked it. DC went overboard, and when you've got Batman building a spear to murder Superman, it's really hard to have your 8-year-old who's wore Batman PJs and watches Batman the Animated Series cartoons enjoy that type of film. And I think the movies show that, but I feel like comics especially have gone overboard with that, in that the amount of cursing that is just in the average Spider-Man issue, the average Doctor Strange or Batman issue. And it's like, look, as an adult, I do appreciate that those stories have still been written to where I can enjoy them. However, I hate that I can't buy the modern Batman comic book that's on the shelves and hand it to my 5-year-old nephew. Because it's like, okay, well, there's going to be 3 or 4 curse words in there, probably some blood and gore. And the thing is, Batman's a character who's so aimed at kids. I mean, they've got Batman training wheels and Batman diapers and all this stuff. So, they're very much advertising the character to anyone who's young. And yet comics, which is the medium you would think they want to get them into, basically kind of has like, hey, man, unless you're like 13, 14 years old, this stuff's going to be difficult for a parent to hand you. And so I think that's a great point. I think the other part, like you said, these characters are kind of cross media at this point, but I think that's actually kind of sad for comics because, the sales of the recent Spider-Man game, the sales of stuff like all these mobile downloadable games like Contest of Champions and things like that, Injustice for the DC universe, the Arkham trilogy of games for Batman, show that there's a definitive interest in the characters. It's just a non-interest in the comics. And like you said, you go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, you have 1.5 million issues of a character like Shazam moving. Now they're lucky if a Batman or Spider-Man comics move in 100,000 copies.
Yeah, I think it's something like you and I've talked about many times. It's like you got to get the kids back into it somehow. Uh, they've made these efforts, and I don't know if you've discovered this at your local comic shop. Well, we shop at the same comic shops, but they'll have a little rack with like what I would call they're like floppy little golden books
Mm-hmm. Yep.
for kids that have the kid stories in them. And that's kind of cute, and I feel comfortable picking those up for my grandkids or whatever to read. And I would buy those and include them, but I would always try and find a traditional comic. But I remember having to ask the salesperson at the store, "Can I give this to my kids or my grandkids?"
Yeah.
Because I know they like Spider-Man, but
Well, no, it's funny is when I was a kid, the thing that got me into comic books and firmly established, Batman as my favorite character was Batman the Animated Series.
yeah,
The coolest things was, I had always had a few comic books, but I remember the time that series was on, there was a concurrently running Batman the Animated Series comic book. When I would go to a shop, I could always pick that up. My parents were like, "Oh, hey, we let you watch this cartoon. You can absolutely pick up that comic." And you look now, I remember my 14 or 15-year-old 6 or 7 years ago when the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon was on, which is a fantastic cartoon.
yeah, that one was really good.
He really loved that iteration of Spider-Man. Go to a comic book store, you can't find anything set in that universe. You can't find that character anywhere. And I always thought that was such a missed opportunity because he'd watch that show and then I'd try to buy him a Spider-Man comic, and it's like, well, okay, in this one, he's not a high schooler. He's an adult. He's like divorced from Mary Jane. He's wearing a different costume. There's very different versions of the villains going on. Like I think at the time Electro was like a girl. It's like he's used to all these things from the cartoon. And I get it, you're always going to have a separate continuity, but those old comics like that used to be the bridge the gap kind of thing that you'd get the kid into the character in comics through that. And then eventually, once that series is over, he's like, oh, but I really love Spider-Man. I'll kind of catch up with the actual comic stories. I've always been shocked with like the MCU and things like that we never saw comics set in the universe of the MCU, that we never had kind of side stories with the characters from the movies. Because, certainly Marvel in the cinematic universe, they told a lot of tales, but you could have absolutely had a Hulk comic book or an Iron Man comic book set in the world of the MCU. And I think you could have not in any way damaged the movies and just had, here's a different Iron Man adventure with the Iron Man from the films. I just think that's a huge missed opportunity they've had.
I think if they reboot both universes, that they could definitely go there. And speaking of reboots, there's that new Superman movie that's
Yep.
coming out.
No, yeah, we have Superman Legacy, and this is, I think, the interesting thing that tells into. You got
So
James Gunn, and he wants to relaunch everything around this Superman film. I think that could be a great place for DC, and I'm hoping Gunn has that vision to do a little bit of synergy
crossing my
between,
fingers.
let's get our Superman kind of aligned to where maybe the presentation you're getting in the movie and something in the comics kind of connects, and that Lord knows that DC keeps rebooting every couple years now at this point in the comics anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think who do they cast for Superman? Have they cast him
David
yet?
Cornsweet is the new Superman, and I think Rachel Brosnahan is the Lois Lane. They're both actors who've been in some smaller stuff. I think the casting wise, they both look like the characters, so I'll give it that. I'll be honest, I haven't seen either one of those in a lot of stuff though.
So yeah, we get some fresh faces, and they're going to tell a good story, hopefully. But you got so much relies on the script. We know James Gunn can direct the heck out of a movie,
No, yeah, I mean, Guardian
But
of the Galaxy, absolutely. Like,
yeah,
you turn characters no one knows into household names.
so like he's getting the chance to, you know, take the flagship character. I hope he does well. I think Superman, like we've always said, if if you're scrapping all the stuff, and I hope they do,
Mhm.
that they've done in the previous universe, and make him hopeful. I know the show. What's the current TV show?
Superman and Lois.
Yeah, Superman and Lois. Um, I almost said Lois and Clark.
Yeah, that old one from the 90s. Yeah, Dean
Yeah,
Cain.
yeah. Um, I hope that they keep him hopeful. The TV show, well, the TV show is the TV show. I enjoyed it though. I have to admit,
I
I
think
watched it.
I think Superman and Lois captures Clark Kent well. I don't like a lot of the plots they've had on the show. Where I have always liked it is its rendition of Clark Kent that they have in that show. The way they have,
Yeah, and the boys and Lois and
he seems like just a nice, kind man. And I think that you need that more than anything in Superman. I
yeah,
think one of the things I'm really tired of with Superman, and I hope James Gunn gets away with it. I am so tired of jaded Superman and evil
yeah,
Superman.
yeah,
Justice and things like that. They got their place. I'm so tired of like, oh, but Superman with a dark side. I think, especially in the world that we have today, having a character like Superman just purely be a force for good, someone
hopeful.
who is a good man who does the right thing because it's the right thing to do, no
Yeah,
agenda involved. Just he is a hero for a hero's sake because of who he was and who he was raised by. I really hope that's what we get. I don't care who the villain is. I don't care what the budget is of the film. I think if you can just tell a good story about, and I think one of the interesting things about Superman is in this complicated world that we have, having a character like that is actually incredibly fascinating because
yeah,
we are so divided in so
yeah,
many ways, politically, religiously, all kinds of different ways in the world. Having someone like Superman who kind of cuts through all the noise and just, I'm going to do the right thing for the right thing's sake. I think that's a movie we honestly really, really need
I
right
do.
now for superheroes.
I really do too. And so, I got both fingers crossed, and I'm hoping for the best, and I hope it does well. But like you and I have said, we kind of think that superhero movies are kind of on the decline.
On the way out. No, and I think, like you said, I think the big takeaway that I'd have of all this, I think with modern comics and movies, I think they need to get back to being hopeful. I think that's
Yes.
the key. Get back to
Yeah.
being hopeful.
Yeah.
Get
I
back
think,
to,
yeah.
like you're saying, those original origins. And that's why I think those characters connected so much better than modern age characters. I think it was a perfect jumping on point for kids. It was something they could aspire to be, something that was, as a parent, you could trust, you could hand those stories to your kids, and it was going to teach them some morality. I hope we can get back to that both in the comic book front and the superhero movie front. In that, while I, as an adult, love that the stories do get a little more mature at times, it should never be at the sake of the kids. The kids should be
Yeah.
the primary target of these books and the movies.
Yeah. I think so too. I mean, you got to be hopeful. And
But let
so,
us know what you think for sure, and if there's anything that what do you think movies and comics should do below. But thanks as always for joining us. We'll see you in the next video.